by the message of Baha'u'llah during the waning years of entry by troops. And Entry by Troops, a highly successful mass Baha'i teaching enterprise initiated in the 1970s in the South, which welcomed a great number of new adherents to the faith of Baha'u'llah. Adalia is the eldest of 5 children whose father was of African descent and mother of Irish-Italian descent. Both of her parents became Baha'is in the early 1970s. She was very active in programs at the Louis Gregory Baha'i Institute and attended the Maxwell International Baha'i School in British Columbia, Canada. It was while attending high school that she was introduced to the special designation given to people of African descent by Baha'u'llah. After high school, she did a youth year of service, then went on to college in South Carolina. After college, she met and married her husband. They lived in Abu Dhabi, UAE, United Arab Emirates, for 2 years before returning stateside and becoming parents. They are now living in Florence, South Carolina, where Adalia is a professor of public speaking at Francis Marion University and is the executive director of both an Afro-Latin dance school, Aroha Afro-Latin Dance, and an arts and social action initiative, Aroha Arts Collective. Through her social action initiative, she hosts a yearly event, the Convergence Symposium, and an online course for white and white passing people committed to anti-racism efforts entitled Our Moral Imperative, a Revolutionary Change in White America, which is her topic for today. We're pleased to have her share with us this morning. So friends, please welcome Adalia.
Good morning, everyone. I am so pleased to be here. Auntie Barbara invited me. I've known her since, it's been a long time. And I'm just really happy to be here. And I just wanted to be reminded real quick of my time. I'm sorry, say that again.
12:30.
You're on mute. That's a long time. Okay.
No, it's not 12:30. It's 12.
Well, 12, not 12:30, 12:40.
But you're a little bit late getting started, so more around 12:20, 12:22, between there somewhere.
Okay, cool. So I want to leave time for discussion and
yes, there will be time
and things like that. So I won't take up the whole time so that there's time for that. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here, make sure that there we go. I use Zoom quite often because of my job as a professor and then because of the online program. Sure. So I'm really comfortable with this thing. Too comfortable, honestly. So Our Moral Imperative, a Revolutionary Change in White America, a conversation long overdue, but always timely. So the imperative and the consequences. No less serious is the stress and strain imposed on the fabric of the American society through the fundamental and persistent neglect by the governed and the governors alike of the supreme, the inescapable and urgent duty, so repeatedly and graphically represented and stressed by Abdu'l-Baha in his arraignment of the basic weaknesses in the social fabric of the nation, of remedying while there is yet time, through a revolutionary change in the concept and attitude of the average white American toward his Negro fellow citizen, a situation which, if allowed to drift, will, in the words of Abdu'l-Baha, cause the streets of American cities to run with blood, aggravating thereby the havoc which the fearful weapons of destruction raining from the air and amassed by a ruthless, a vigilant, and powerful and inveterate armed enemy will wreak upon those same cities. Shoghi Effendi, Citadel of Faith. So, the oneness of humanity through the pupil of the eye. So, I think when I wanted to speak on this topic, I felt like it would be important for me to kind of tell a little bit of my story. So, like I said, I grew up in South Carolina, and when I was very young, like I said, it was the waning years of the entry by troops, and anyone who was living in South Carolina and probably parts of Georgia around that time, a lot of the people who entered into the Baha'i faith were people of African descent. And in hindsight, now that I'm older and I understand the history of the experience of people of African descent and really the African diaspora, once I understand the experience and I've understood the history, I understand now why so many people became Baha'is. Because within the message of Baha'u'llah, there was the promise of freedom from this pain. There was a promise of freedom and liberation from the systemic issues that faced our communities. So I grew up with a lot of singing, a lot of, I remember doing door-to-door teaching and visiting with people when I was as young as 4 or 5. My parents took me out into the most remotest areas of South Carolina where people didn't have bathrooms, they didn't have plumbing, didn't have electricity. And this was in the 1970s, early 80s. And just the love and the move, the energy, and the spirit of the teachings of Baha'u'llah just galvanized thousands and thousands of people in South Carolina, and particularly a town not far from Florence, where I live right now, Dillon, South Carolina. I mean, there were whole churches, congregations of people became Baha'is because they saw in this revelation the voice of Jesus. They saw in this revelation, like I said earlier, a hope. And so as I grew older and got, older and older and, into my early teens, I just started noticing how a lot of the people that I knew when I was a child were less and less present in the spaces that I occupied. And, when you're a kid, you don't really think about all of the things, but you're things that I'm reminded of is that never underestimate what children notice. And I noticed things that I didn't have context for when I was younger, but now that I'm older, I understand better. And honestly, it wasn't until I was at Maxwell, I would say it was in my sophomore year, that I'd ever heard of the term that Baha'u'llah designated to people of African descent, the pupil of the eye. I'd never heard that term. And for me to get all the way to my sophomore year in high school and not have heard that, and not have began to understand the real, the energy, the power, the implications of that designation by Baha'u'llah was, when I look back on it now, it's a little bit tragic, because I grew up during a time where, and I think it may be still the same way, but I'm not in school anymore as a kid. I grew up as a Black child. It didn't matter that my mother was white. And so with that came, there was just juxtaposition in the Baha'i community. I saw lots of kids like me. And I grew up understanding that we were all one human family, right? But then I went to school and was treated a completely different way. And I have to say that had I known kind of how Baha'u'llah, this designation that he gave to people of African descent, I wonder sometimes if my experience as a child would have been different. So the importance of never underestimating how early and how soon this type of education needs to be given to our children of African descent, and honestly, to children of all races, but particularly to children of African descent who are experiencing um, really, they're experiencing microaggressions, they're experiencing hardships that this would give context for. It would also let you know that what you're seeing is not crazy, that you're not just kind of making things up in your mind, that as a pupil of the eye, you see what's happening before you, and what you see is the truth. And there's something that's powerful about understanding that, even when you're very young. So this awakening to the pupil of the eye it just changed everything for me. When I was at Maxwell, it changed everything. Um, my hair, I used to be ashamed of my hair. And I just started embracing everything about me. I will admit there was a level of anger, because as you begin to understand the truth of your ancestors, the truth of all these things, this anger comes out. But within the context of when I was at Maxwell, there was a group called the Pupil of the Eye, and it was specifically for the students of African and African descent. And that space was a beautiful space to navigate through coming to terms with what it means to be a Black person, but then also being a Baha'i. So that was a beautiful experience for me. After I graduated Maxwell, I kind of traveled around a little bit, and I ended up in Chicago. And me and some friends of mine, this is when I was in my early 20s, we were at a Baha'i school in right outside of Chicago. And we gave this workshop on around race. And one of my friends who was presenting with me was he's South African, and he'd been living in Chicago. I'm not sure how long at this point. It's been a few years, and he had told this story about how he was walking home to his house one night, and he got stopped by the police, and how often that was happening to him, and how that was affecting him. And the one thing that stood out from that exchange was not that it did not seem to engender empathy in the white and Persian youth in that room. The response that we got back was from one of the youth that's always stuck with me, in kind of in a defensive way, that Bob Henderson hasn't been stopped by police. And that somehow this thought that you could be in this space in the Baha'i community as an African American person, and I'm not going to go into all the stuff around people kind of creating dichotomies around popularity and things like that. But at the time, Bob Henderson was the secretary of the NSA, and he had been for years, and lived in right around the National Center. And what struck me about that and was just the disconnect that, one, I don't know if this child had ever had a conversation with Bob Henderson about whether or not he was stopped by the police. And it was my first time really realizing that people really think that money and position protects people of African descent. And that, and in the same voice, it was then saying to my friend who was sharing this really traumatic experience for him, completely disregarded what he just said. Okay, so those types of behaviors in these spaces that we share with our white and Persian friends can be harmful and unsafe. To hear Black stories, the stories of the Black experience, right? Then, you know, during around that same time, I had a Baha'i youth workshop. It was actually a bunch of pre-youth, and a lot of them were African American, and we had gone to a Baha'i youth conference. And I had probably like 10 of them with me. And we were the only representation of Black people at this Baha'i youth conference. In a place, it was in DC, where you have Howard University, you've got Black community, but we were the only Black group in this space. And my group was so uncomfortable because the Persian, particularly the Persian youth, but some of the white youth, like they were getting these dirty looks from them. They were being, you know, purposely left out of things. And so they all kind of stayed together because they were so uncomfortable in this space. And I remember right before the junior youth got on the stage to perform, this little white girl, she must have been 10 years old. She walks up to me at the side of the stage and she says, "Thank you for bringing Black people." And that is the community, right? So then we wonder why so many people of African descent have disengaged from the community. We wonder why there's so little representation in a place like South Carolina, where now we experience entry by troops here, but our LSAs don't reflect the demographics. Our communities don't reflect the demographics. Most people of African descent have stopped coming to Baha'i things years ago and just went back to church. And the interesting thing is that when we go back years later and talk with people, they still consider themselves Baha'is, but there was no place for them in the Baha'i community. And I personally, no one else may feel this, but I feel like the entry by troops effort was undermined by white supremacy. It was undermined by unacknowledged and not doing the work that Shoghi Effendi gave to our white friends. And there's been talk over the years that somehow the entry by troops experience in South Carolina was a failed attempt. There was no failure. It was that there are people here who are still connected to Baha'u'llah. And as I said, it was undermined by white supremacy, and I will go into that in just a moment. But the thing that the entry by troops experienced in South Carolina, it inspired what we know today as the study circles. It was the first time that we came to understand that we needed a system of education that would support large numbers of people coming into the faith. So the work. So the work for our white Baha'i brothers and sisters, and I would also include our Persian Baha'i brothers and sisters, our Hispanic Baha'i brothers and sisters, is I have it all highlighted, right? So to abandon once for all their inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority, to correct their tendency towards revealing a patronizing attitude, to persuade through their intimate, spontaneous, and informal association of the genuineness of their friendship and the sincerity of their intentions, and to master impatience of any lack of responsiveness on a people who have received for so long a period such grievous and soul-healing wounds. This is the work. This is the work for our white friends. And I know that for many people, you probably know that there is a corresponding part to this that is for people of African descent. I left that out on purpose because what I have seen over and over and over again is Black believers are basically faced with two choices. They can stay in the Baha'i community and push their way through Baha'u'llah's grace and just through prayer and, talking with their friends of African descent, and maybe their one or two friends who are white that will listen. They can push through and they say, this faith is my faith. I'm going to keep at this. I'm going to keep doing it, right? Despite all of the things that happen within the community, I'm going to keep doing it, right? And so we've kept and we've kept and we've kept. I feel like folks have forgiven and forgiven and forgiven over and over and over again. People have been open to friendship. There has not been a time, for me at least in my experience with my circle of friends of African descent, that any of us have cut off being open to friendship with our white and Persian believer friends, right? That has not happened. But what hasn't happened in a collective, like truly critical mass movement, what hasn't happened is this work by our white friends. So the onus has been on the Black community for years to stay engaged despite. So that's the one choice. The other choice is just to completely leave the community, which a lot of people have chosen to do. And people, people of African descent go through waves of being very engaged, and then waves of needing a break, and then waves of being very engaged, and then waves of needing a break. And I can only speak from my own experience. I don't want to say this is like the experience of every person of African descent in this space today, but it has been the experience that I have seen of my friends, and this experience that I have seen here in South Carolina with the mass exodus of people of African descent, the mass exodus, to the point that at one point we had so many LSAs that had to be elected every year that we were given like an extra week or two to get all the elections done. That's not happening anymore. That many people have really disconnected from the community, not from Baha'u'llah. Let's make that clear, but from the community. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that our white friends have not done this work. So through the work I've been doing with our moral imperative, I've come to realize that anti-racism efforts are on a spectrum. And just like there's no monolithic Black experience, like you can't say all Black people are like this, you can't say all white people are like that, right? But there is a spectrum of anti-racism efforts. So you have complete silence, and that is just folks who just don't speak up, they don't notice, they don't have, they don't say anything. Then you have speaking up without self-awareness. So something that I've also come to realize is that the Black community has had hundreds of years to deal with this. They've had hundreds of years, probably millions of conversations, tons of prayer, resilience building, language building, pupil of the eye seeing experience with racism. Our white and Persian friends are woefully behind. So sometimes people who believe in the oneness of mankind and know that racism is wrong, they'll come into spaces with disregarding the years of experience behind people of African descent and speak up in those spaces completely not connected to what's happened and lacking the language. lacking the historical understanding of race in America, lacking all of that information, they aren't really able to show up in an effective way in the space. So then speaking up in anger without self-awareness. So then you have moving into our white friends and Persian friends who feel strongly that race is wrong, and they see when things are happening and they speak up with this anger that shuts down conversations. So in the end, it doesn't actually help the African American community, because the conversation ends, because the anger and the way the words that are used, it shuts down the conversation with other white people, other Persian people. And I say that this comes also without awareness, really centering white anger at racism rather than centering and being empathetic to the Black experience and saying, hey, if they can still hold conversations with people after experiencing traumas and microaggressions, you know what? I can change, I can use my words in a different way to continue this conversation with this white person, so that a Black person doesn't have to have this conversation if they don't want to, and isn't re-triggered. So I have a lot of Black friends, Baha'is and not Baha'is, who are triggered by conversations now with people who are unaware. They're triggered by it. So then the next is, having good intentions, recognizing that racism is wrong, but then being undermined by unacknowledged white supremacy tendencies. So this goes back to doing the work. When the work is happening and you're actively engaged, you're mindfully engaged in how am I showing up in this space, those good intentions actually become helpful in this space. But sometimes those good intentions become not helpful, in that you come into the space, you see there's a problem, and you want to address the problem. But then what is developed out of that is handed to the Black friends, and we're like, what do we do with this? Like, this is not what we wanted, right? This is not what we wanted. This needed to be done in a consultative space, and our voice is not included in the solution that you've brought, right? And then the behavior of, and I've seen this happen, of friends who've done all this work without really consulting the Black friends, getting their feelings hurt and getting defensive because it's just not, oh, thank you. This isn't what I want, but thank you, right? Good intentions that include the work lead to real change. So then there's the self-aware, reflective. So you're reflecting, you're self-aware, you're aware of these things that are showing up, you're ready to do the work, but you just don't know where to start, right? That is the perfect place for conversations. That's the perfect place to have conversations with your Black friends. And sometimes even that, it's kind of like read a book. I have Black friends that's like, read a book. If you want to know where to start, read a book. If you want to know where to start, look at the statistics. Look at the statistics of what's happening to our Black communities, and find a way to use your talents and your skills to help in that situation, and include people of African descent in that process. Don't do for us, do with us. And then lastly, and this is where I'm really excited, because people, I'm experiencing this in our moral imperative. People are getting to this stage, which is so exciting. And that's when people are self-aware, reflective, and actively mindful about how they show up in a space. Like, they think about it when they walk into the grocery store, when they walk into their classroom, when they walk into a meeting. They're already mindful. I am possessing a space of privilege. I am a white person expressing, in a space of privilege with unaware, embedded white supremacist tendencies. I'm mindful of this. So then being able to notice the tendency and stopping before acting on it. I'm excited because I have quite a few people in the Our Moral Imperative program who have moved into this space. And then this is where real change and real consultation with people of color can happen in a way that's effective and it's collaborative. And this is where you create trust with the Black community. And then Black people who have for years shown their tendency to be accepting are able to do that and be safe. Okay, so finally, I'm looking at my time. Come on, where am I? Cool, yeah. All right, I'm a public speaking teacher. Keep things in time. So showing up on the long and thorny road. Listening, 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 listening. Listening has to be one of the most underused, underrated, just people don't use listening very often. And when I say listening, I mean active listening. So you're listening to understand, not to respond. I use this a lot in my public speaking classes, that you're listening to hear what people are saying underneath. And I love the story of Abdu'l-Baha. I think that it personifies the level of listening that needs to happen right now in our white and Persian communities, Baha'i community. The story, you can find in vignettes of Abdu'l-Baha, where there was this really annoying reporter. He shows up to this, the house or the place that Abdu'l-Baha is, and there's all these, really well-known Baha'is there, and this man shows up and they're really annoyed by him, like they don't like him. They're trying to keep him, they don't want him in the space, right? So they're kind of they're not being welcome. They're not being warm. And Abdu'l-Baha, seeing this, takes this gentleman on his own into a room with him. And Abdu'l-Baha just sits and listens. And listens, and this man just talks and talks and talks and talks. And Abdu'l-Baha listens to this man so deeply and so profoundly that he knew that he was being seen. He knew that Abdu'l-Baha saw him. And that's where we need to be right now in our Baha'i communities. So centering the voices of Black and Indigenous people. Slow down. Many, many times embedded white supremacy shows up when the focus is on the product and not the process. Slow down. Initiate friendships. Acquaintances are not friends. So showing up to feast, or showing up to a holy day, or showing up to some sort of gathering where there's Black friends there, and you have a conversation and you talk, and then you go home. If you haven't had a conversation with them beyond that space, you're not friends. That's an acquaintance. You know just this much about that person, and they know just this much about you. You have not heard their heart at that point. You may have gotten glimpses of it, but I'm telling you that a friendship can hold space. A friendship holds space. A friendship, a person can tell you, this is what I experienced, and the person hearing it listens and takes it in, and you become trusted with potentially painful experiences. You become trusted with that. That's a friendship. So if you don't have friendships, and if you look at your circle, if you have a lot of acquaintances who happen to be people of African descent, but they're not friends, I think beginning to reimagine what unity and love looks like. Reimagine what that looks like, and being able to have, when Shoghi Effendi talks about the genuineness of friendship, inviting people into your home, not now, of course, but, doing some sort of Zoom call or phone call, and just having a friendship like you would with anyone else. What's been used a lot in the Baha'i community is love and unity have been used to shut down conversations that are uncomfortable. That this isn't unity. This doesn't feel like unity. If a Black person or a Native person says, this has been my experience in this space, what begins to happen is unity and love become weapons to discontinue that conversation. Reimagine what that looks like. Unity is strong enough to hold pain. Love is strong enough to hold discomfort. Trust in that unity and love to take us beyond where we are. Listen more than speak. The moment you think you have arrived is the moment that you show you have more work to do. That just because as Baha'is, we believe in the oneness of humanity, we believe in, the eradication of prejudices of all kind, it doesn't mean we don't have work to do. And it doesn't absolve us of the work that needs to be done. And then to understand that this work is lifelong and it will get messy, and it is messy. But to build this muscle of resilience needs to be the core part of that process, becoming resilient in this work, because we are undoing centuries of hurt. We're undoing centuries, not just of hurt, but systematic and systemic oppression that did not actually start here in America. It started actually in Europe. This idea of the supremacy of whites began through colonization. It began in Europe and was brought to America. So this is older than even slavery. This is older than slavery. This is older than the annihilation of entire tribes of indigenous people. It's older than that. There is something about what happened in Europe that created this space in the minds of so many European people that for some reason, for them to feel noble, they had to put other people below them. I don't know where that came from, but understanding that we are undoing centuries of erroneous thought. And Baha'u'llah came to help us do that. But the writings are not passive. The writings are not passive. They're not meant to be read and then you go off and do your own thing. The writings are meant to be acted upon. And the work that is done around the guidance is the work that will see the healing of the wounds of racism. And so I really encourage, implore our white and Persian friends to do the work and step into the arena where things are messy, where things are not comfortable. But believe me, guess what? You got a whole bunch of Black and brown friends who can completely empathize with you, who can say, I have been there, stay in it, stay in it. Because on the other side, there is healing. On the other side, there's something we haven't gotten to yet. So trust in your Black and brown friends to carry you through the, to work with you through the discomfort. And so our moral imperative, a revolutionary change in white America.
Is that the end? Well, how enlightening. Thank you so much, Adalia, for breaking down this not so frequently talked about aspect of the work which has to be done to heal the slow healing wounds of racism. I like that perspective, stop weaponizing unity and love to shut down that conversation. It's awesome. Friends, Adalia is prepared to take questions and any responses that you might have to her presentation. So anyone with any comments or questions, please feel free to share at this time. Ruha.
Allahu Akbar. Thank you, Adalia. Thank you so much for your inspiring presentation. I loved it and took a lesson. I wanted to share with you whether you agree that